On a cold autumn night in 1847, beneath the towering iron gates of Thornfield Manor, a young woman stands trembling in the rain. Eliza Marin has nothing left but the tattered dress on her back, and a desperate plea for shelter. The Duke of Thornfield, Alistair Hawthorne, is known throughout England as a man of ice and formality, a widower who locked his heart away years ago. When she begs him for nothing more than a corner in his barn, his answer surprises everyone, including himself. What happens when an act of simple kindness begins to thaw a frozen heart? And when does compassion become something society cannot forgive? Before we step back into that stormy night, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years before that stormy night, Thornfield Manor had been a different place entirely. The estate sprawled across the Yorkshire countryside like a sleeping giant, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of English rain, its gardens meticulously maintained by a staff of 20. The manor house itself boasted 42 rooms, each furnished with the careful attention that old money demanded. Persian rugs lay thick upon oak floors. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallway. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and scattered it like diamonds across plaster ceilings, adorned with scenes from Greek mythology. But for all its grandeur, Thornfield had become a tomb. Duke Alistair Hawthorne rose each morning at precisely 6 o'clock. His valet, Mr. Garrett, would enter the ducal chamber with pressed clothes laid carefully over his arm, and the Duke would dress in silence. Breakfast was taken alone in the small dining room at 7. Toast, 2 eggs, tea without sugar. The Times was read from front to back, though Alistair retained little of what he read these days. The words simply passed before his eyes like meaningless shadows. By 8, he would be in his study, attending to correspondence, letters from his steward about crop yields and tenant concerns, invitations from London society that he declined with practiced brevity, bills from merchants that he signed without examination. His solicitor's reports on investments that continued to grow his already substantial wealth, though he cared nothing for the figures. The household staff moved through the manor like ghosts themselves, speaking in whispers, careful not to disturb their master's silence. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, ran the establishment with military precision. She had been at Thornfield for 30 years, since before Alistair was born, and she remembered when these halls had echoed with laughter. Now she enforced quiet as though noise itself were an affront to mourning. Mr. Graves, the butler, was equally rigid in his devotion to propriety. He supervised the footmen with a critical eye, ensuring every surface gleamed, every piece of silver shone, every corner remained dust-free. The manor was maintained as a showcase, though no guests ever came to see it. Alistair knew what the staff whispered about him. He heard the phrase that had followed him to London and back, the Ice Duke. He'd heard it first at his club, murmured behind newspapers, then from distant relatives who wrote concerned letters about his continued isolation. Finally from his sister, Lady Margaret, who'd said it to his face during her last visit. "You've become ice, Alistair," she'd told him, her eyes filled with frustrated tears. "Catherine wouldn't have wanted this for you." He'd said nothing in response. What could he say? That she was right, that he knew he'd stopped living the day Catherine died, that he rose and dressed and ate and worked, not because he wanted to, but because the alternative required more energy than he possessed. On his left hand, he wore a mourning ring of black onyx set in gold. He'd commissioned it the week after Catherine's funeral, and had not removed it since. The weight of it was a constant reminder, though he needed none. Every room in this house spoke her name: the music room where she'd played piano each evening, the garden where she'd tended roses, the library where they'd read together by firelight, and most painfully, the nursery on the 3rd floor that he'd locked and never entered again. Catherine had died bringing their daughter into the world. The child had lived only 6 hours, her tiny lungs too weak to sustain her. In a single day, Alistair had lost both his wife and his daughter, and something inside him had simply stopped working. His heart continued to beat, his lungs continued to draw breath, but the part of him that felt, that hoped, that dreamed had been buried alongside them in the family crypt. He was 42 years old, the 7th Duke of Thornfield, master of an estate worth over £50,000 per annum, and he felt nothing but the endless grey weight of days stretching before him like a prison sentence. Society expected him to remarry eventually. It was his duty to produce an heir. But the thought of touching another woman, of pretending to feel something he no longer could, filled him with a weariness so profound he could barely stand under it. So he continued his routines: wake, dress, eat, work, sleep, each day identical to the last. The staff maintained the illusion that this was a living household, but everyone knew the truth. Thornfield Manor had become a mausoleum, and the Duke its only occupant who still drew breath. Eliza Marin had not always been destitute. There had been a time, though it seemed like someone else's life now, when she'd known warmth and security, and the simple comfort of a full belly. Her father, Thomas Marin, had been a skilled carpenter in Manchester, a man with steady hands and an inquiring mind. He'd believed in education as fervently as he believed in God, and he'd taught his daughter to read using his own worn Bible and whatever newspapers he could collect from the coffee houses. By the time Eliza was 10, she could read better than most boys twice her age. By 15, she'd worked her way through every book the parish lending library possessed. Her mother, Anne, had been a seamstress with a gentle disposition and a voice like honey. She'd sung while she worked, old ballads and hymns that filled their small rooms above the workshop with something approaching joy. She'd taught Eliza to sew fine stitches, to mend torn cloth so the repair was nearly invisible, to create beauty from scraps. They hadn't been wealthy, but they'd been content. The three of them together, making their way in the world. Then her father had fallen from a scaffold while working on a merchant's grand house. 3 stories down onto cobblestone. He died before the doctor arrived, his skilled hands finally stilled. Eliza had been 17. Without his income, everything had unraveled like poorly made cloth. Her mother had taken in more sewing, working by candlelight until her eyes ached and her fingers bled. Eliza had found work in the textile mills, 12 hours a day in the deafening roar of machinery, breathing air thick with cotton dust. The wages were barely enough to keep them in their rooms. 2 years later, her mother had begun coughing. At first it seemed nothing, just a cold that wouldn't quite clear. But it had worsened through the winter, deep rattling coughs that shook her thin frame. By spring, there was blood on her handkerchief. By summer, she could no longer leave her bed. Eliza had spent everything on doctors who could do nothing, and medicines that provided no relief. She'd held her mother's hand through the final weeks, listening to her labored breathing, watching her waste away to nothing but skin and fever-bright eye. The night before she died, Anne had pressed something into Eliza's palm, a brass locket, simple and worn smooth with years of handling. "This was mine," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Keep it close, my darling girl. Remember that you come from love, whatever else may happen." Eliza had opened the locket to find a faded portrait, so old the features were barely distinguishable. A young woman with kind eyes. Her grandmother, she'd assumed. Her mother had died the next morning as dawn broke, over the factory rooftops. Eliza had been 20 years old, alone in the world, with nothing but the clothes she wore and the locket around her neck. She'd continued at the mill for another year, living in a boarding house for working women, eating thin soup and yesterday's bread, saving every penny she could. She'd told herself she was building towards something better, though she couldn't have said what. Then the mill had closed. Foreign cotton had become too expensive. The owner had explained to the assembled workers there was nothing to be done. They were all dismissed effective immediately, with 2 weeks' wages as severance. Eliza had exhausted those wages within a month. The boarding house matron, kind but practical, had given her 3 days to find new employment or vacate her room. But there was no work to be found. Manchester was full of former mill workers, all desperate, all competing for positions that didn't exist. On the 4th day, she'd left the city with nothing but what she could carry. She had some vague notion of reaching the countryside, where perhaps a farmer might need help with harvest, or a village family might want a maid. She'd walked south and west, sleeping in hedgerows, drinking from streams, eating whatever she could forage or afford with the few remaining pennies in her pocket. 3 days of walking had brought her to Yorkshire, 3 days of growing hunger and exhaustion and fear. The autumn weather had turned cold, and she had no proper coat. Her shoes, already worn, had developed holes that let in every pebble and puddle. When the storm had begun that evening, she'd been following a country road with no idea where it led. The rain had come down in sheets, soaking through her threadbare dress in minutes. She'd been shaking with cold, her teeth chattering so hard she'd bitten her tongue. Then she'd seen the gates. Massive iron things, ornate and imposing, attached to stone pillars that seemed to reach toward the darkening sky. Beyond them, at the end of a long drive, lights glowed in the windows of what could only be a great house. She'd stood there in the rain, pride warring with desperation. She'd never begged in her life. Her father had taught her dignity, her mother had taught her grace, but she was so cold, so tired, so utterly without options. The locket lay heavy against her heart as she'd pushed open the gate and started up the drive. The servants' entrance at Thornfield Manor stood to the side of the main house, a practical door of solid oak meant for deliveries and staff. Eliza approached it with her head bowed, rain streaming down her face, her wet hair plastered to her skull. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a tall man in impeccable butler's attire. His face was all sharp angles and disapproval. He looked at Eliza the way one might regard something unpleasant, tracked in on someone's shoe. "The tradesman's entrance is not for vagrants," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "Move along, please," Eliza managed through chattering teeth. "I don't want charity, just shelter from the storm. A corner of the barn, anything. I'll be gone by morning." "Absolutely not. His Grace maintains a respectable household. We do not harbor strays." The butler, Mr. Graves, began to close the door. Eliza felt something crack inside her. 3 days of walking, of hunger, of fear, and now this final rejection in the freezing rain. She swayed on her feet, dizzy with exhaustion and cold. "Please," she whispered one more time, but the door was already closing. She turned away, her vision blurring. She would have to find shelter elsewhere. Perhaps there was a hay barn somewhere on the property, something she could reach without permission. She took a step back down the path and stumbled, catching herself against the stone wall. "What's happening here?" The voice came from the darkness beyond the circle of light from the doorway, deep, measured, with the unmistakable accent of education and authority. Eliza looked up to see a man approaching from the direction of the gardens, a dark cloak around his shoulders. Even in the rain and shadows, she could see he was tall, his posture military straight, despite what appeared to be a walking stick in his hand. Mr. Graves stiffened. "Your Grace, I was just sending away a vagrant who came begging at the door. I apologize for the disturbance." The man stepped into the light, and Eliza found herself looking at a face that might have been carved from marble. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at her. This was the Duke, then, the master of this great house. She had disturbed him personally. Shame flooded through her. "My lord," she said, forcing herself to straighten, despite the shaking in her limbs. "I apologize for the intrusion. I asked only for shelter in your barn. I'll trouble you no further. She tried to step past him, back toward the gate, but her legs wouldn't quite cooperate. The world tilted strangely. When did you last eat? The Duke's question surprised her. 2 days ago. Some bread. It might have been 3 days. She couldn't quite remember. And you've been walking in this storm? Yes, my lord. There was a long silence. Eliza kept her eyes down, staring at the ground. She could feel both men looking at her, the butler with irritation, the Duke with something she couldn't identify. She waited for dismissal, for the final rejection that would send her back into the night. Graves, the Duke said finally, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Have Mrs. Pemberton prepare a room in the servants' quarters. This woman will stay the night. Eliza's head snapped up. The butler's face had gone rigid with shock. Your Grace, I must protest. The propriety of the situation. I'm aware of propriety, Graves. The Duke's tone hadn't changed, but something in it made the butler fall silent. I'm also aware that it's barely above freezing, the storm shows no sign of abating, and this woman is close to collapse. Prepare a room, have cook send up soup and bread. See that she has dry clothes. Your Grace. The butler's disapproval radiated from every line of his body, but he bowed and retreated into the house. Eliza stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The Duke looked at her, really looked at her, and something flickered in those cold eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Though not of her personally, recognition of something more fundamental. What's your name? He asked. Eliza Marin, my lord. You may stay until the weather clears, Miss Marin, but I expect you'll be on your way once the storm passes. Yes, my lord. Thank you, my lord. The words came automatically, though her mind was reeling. He nodded once, then began to turn away, but he paused, reached up, and unfastened the cloak from around his shoulders. Before she could protest, he draped it over her, the heavy wool still warm from his body heat. You're soaked through, he said simply. Then he walked past her into the house, leaving her standing in the rain, wrapped in his cloak, smelling of sandalwood and tobacco, more confused than she'd ever been in her life. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear the beginning of urgent whispers as the household absorbed this unprecedented breach of protocol. Mrs. Pemberton arrived in the entrance hall like a ship in full sail, her keys jangling at her waist, her face set in lines of profound disapproval. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, the sodden girl clutching the Duke's cloak around her shoulders, Graves standing rigid with barely contained outrage, and most troubling of all, His Grace himself standing in the hallway, rain dripping from his hair, watching this spectacle unfold. Your Grace, she said, her voice tight. Mr. Graves has informed me of your instructions. Might I have a word in private? You may not. The Duke's response was immediate and final. Miss Marin requires immediate attention. See to it, please. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. As you wish, Your Grace. Come along then, girl. Eliza followed Mrs. Pemberton through a maze of corridors, her wet shoes squelching against polished floors. Behind her she could hear hushed voices, the household stirring with this unprecedented event. A maid peered around a corner, eyes wide. A footman stopped mid-step to stare. The servants' quarters were on the 3rd floor, a warren of small but clean rooms that housed the unmarried staff. Mrs. Pemberton led her to one at the far end of the hallway, opened the door, and gestured inside with barely concealed irritation. There's a bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. I'll have Sarah bring you something dry to wear, and food from the kitchen. You'll remain here until His Grace determines your departure. Do not wander the house. Do not speak to His Grace, unless directly addressed. Do not give anyone reason to gossip more than they already will. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened slightly, though her disapproval remained. You look half dead, girl. Get out of those wet things before you catch your death. She paused at the door. His Grace is not himself tonight. Whatever you think this means, it means nothing. Come morning, You'll be on your way." When the door closed, Eliza stood alone in the small room, still clutching the Duke's cloak. She was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Carefully, reverently, she folded the cloak and laid it over the back of the single wooden chair. Then she peeled off her wet dress, her underthings, everything, until she stood naked and shivering in the lamplight. A young maid arrived minutes later with an armful of clothes and a tray of food. She set both down without a word, her curious eyes taking in everything before she scurried away. The clothes were simple servant's attire, a plain grey dress, clean undergarments, thick stockings, even a shawl. Eliza dressed slowly, her numb fingers fumbling with buttons. The clothes were slightly too large, but they were dry and warm, and smelled of lavender soap. The food made her eyes burn with tears. A bowl of thick vegetable soup, still steaming, fresh bread with butter, a cup of hot tea with milk and sugar. More food than she'd seen in a week. She forced herself to eat slowly, though everything in her screamed to devour it all at once. Her stomach had shrunk from days of deprivation. She managed half the soup, 2 slices of bread, and the entire cup of tea before exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. The bed was narrow but clean, the blankets rough wool but warm. Eliza crawled beneath them, her locket still around her neck, and felt tears sliding down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. She was warm. She was fed. She was safe, at least for tonight. She thought of the Duke's face in the lamplight, those cold eyes that had nonetheless held something, some flicker of recognition or understanding, the way he'd given her his cloak without hesitation, a gesture so simple, yet so profound it had undone her. Why had he helped her? Men of his station did not trouble themselves with vagrant women at their gates. They certainly did not invite them into their homes, however, temporarily. Mrs. Pemberton was right to be scandalized. This was unprecedented. Yet he had done it anyway. Somewhere below, in the parts of the house she would never see, the Duke was probably in his study or his chambers, having already forgotten about the bedraggled woman he'd taken in from the storm. She was nothing to him, a momentary impulse of charity, perhaps prompted by the sight of her collapse. Nothing more. By morning she would be gone, and his life would return to its normal rhythms. She would be a footnote, if that. The girl he'd sheltered, one stormy night. But as Eliza drifted into sleep, warm and fed for the first time in days, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the cold man who had shown her unexpected kindness. 3 floors below, in his private study, Alistair Hawthorne sat at his desk with an untouched glass of brandy before him. He should have been reviewing the estate accounts. Instead, he found himself staring at nothing, his mind replaying the moment he'd seen her at the door. Something about her face, rain-soaked and desperate, had pierced through the numbness he'd cultivated so carefully. Something about her dignity despite her circumstances had reminded him of what it felt like to care about another person's suffering. He'd acted on impulse, something he never did. He'd broken protocol, invited scandal, troubled his household, all for a woman whose name he'd already half forgotten, except he hadn't forgotten. Eliza Marin. The name echoed in his mind as he sat in the darkness, wondering what on earth had possessed him, and why he didn't regret it. Morning light found Eliza already awake, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, wearing yesterday's borrowed dress. She'd slept deeply for the first time in weeks, dreamless and complete, and had woken with the guilty realization that she'd overstayed her welcome. The storm had passed. Clear autumn sky showed through the small window. She needed to leave before she caused the Duke any more trouble. She folded the blankets with care, arranged the room exactly as she'd found it, and made her way down the servants' stairs. In the kitchen, she found a flurry of morning activity. A stout woman, who could only be the cook, stood at a massive range, directing 2 kitchen maids in the preparation of breakfast. The smells of frying bacon and fresh bread made Eliza's stomach clench with hunger, despite last night's meal. The cook noticed her hovering in the doorway. "You'd be the girl from last night then. Sit yourself down. Can't send anyone out without a proper breakfast, storm or no storm. I don't want to be any trouble, ma'am. Too late for that, I'd say. But the cook's voice held humor rather than judgment. I'm Mrs. Patterson. You'll eat what I put in front of you, and then we'll see about getting you on your way. His Grace left instructions you were to be fed before departure. Eliza sat at the long wooden table where the servants took their meals. Miss Patterson placed before her a plate piled with eggs, bacon, toast, and fried tomatoes. A cup of strong tea appeared beside it. Thank you, Eliza whispered. I'll repay this kindness somehow. Eat, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. We'll worry about the rest after. As Eliza ate, trying not to devour the food too quickly, the kitchen filled with more staff. Footmen appeared for their morning tea. Housemaids collected supplies for cleaning. Mr. Graves swept through with his usual air of severe authority, though he pointedly ignored Eliza's presence. The conversation flowed around her, the easy banter of people who'd worked together for years. But Eliza noticed the glances thrown her way, the whispered comments. She'd become the morning scandal. When she'd finished eating, Mrs. Patterson gestured for her to remain seated. His Grace wants a word before you go. Wait here. Eliza's heart sank. She'd hoped to slip away without further troubling him. Now she would have to face him in daylight, see clearly the man who'd shown her such unexpected mercy. But it wasn't the Duke who appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Mr. Graves, looking even more disapproving than the night before. Miss Marin, His Grace requests your presence in the library. The walk through Thornfield's grand rooms was like entering another world. Eliza tried not to gawk at the paintings, the furniture, the sheer wealth displayed in every corner. Mr. Graves led her to a set of double doors, knocked once, and opened them without waiting for response. Miss Marin, Your Grace. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, filled with more books than Eliza had ever seen. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a massive desk where the Duke sat. Papers spread before him. He looked up as she entered, and in the daylight she could see him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair silvered at the temples. His face was handsome in a stern way, all sharp planes and controlled expression. But it was his eyes that caught her, grey as winter sky, and just as cold. Yet something in them, some barely perceptible warmth, suggested this coldness wasn't his natural state, but rather something he'd constructed. Miss Marin, I trust you slept well. Very well, Your Grace. I and thank you enough for your kindness. The storm has passed. You're free to continue your journey. He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Where exactly are you going? I'm not certain, my lord. I hope to find work in one of the villages. Farm work, perhaps, or a position in service. Do you have references? No, my lord. I worked in the Manchester mills until they closed. Before that, I helped my mother with sewing. Can you read? The question surprised her. Yes, my lord. My father taught me. Something shifted in his expression. The kitchen is short a helper. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it just yesterday. The position includes room and board, plus a small wage. It's honest work, respectable. Would you be interested? Eliza stared at him, unable to speak. A position, here, in this grand house with its warm kitchens and soft beds, and more food than she'd seen in months. Her voice caught. Your Grace, I would be more than interested. I would be grateful beyond words. It's settled then. Mrs. Pemberton will see to the details. You'll report to Miss Patterson each morning. The position is temporary, Yun. We'll evaluate after a month, whether it suits both parties. Yes, Your Grace. Thank you, Your Grace. He nodded dismissal and returned to his papers. The conversation apparently over. But as Eliza turned to leave, he spoke again. Miss Marin, that locket you wear, it seems precious to you. Her hand went instinctively to the brass locket at her throat. It was my mother's, my lord. My only possession of value, though I doubt it would fetch much at market. Keep it het then. Some things are worth more than market value. There was something in his voice, some echo of loss that matched her own. She curtsied and left, her mind spinning with this unexpected turn of fortune. A week passed, and Eliza settled into the rhythms of Thornfield's kitchen with surprising ease. Miss Patterson proved to be a fair mistress, demanding hard work, but offering patience when Eliza struggled with unfamiliar tasks. There was bread to knead, vegetables to prepare, pots to scrub, floors to sweep. The work was endless but honest, and Eliza threw herself into it with gratitude. The other servants remained cautious around her. Some, like Mrs. Patterson and young Sarah the housemaid, showed genuine kindness. Others, particularly those who'd served the household longest, regarded her with suspicion. She was an outsider, elevated from vagrant to employee by the Duke's inexplicable whim. It was unprecedented, and therefore suspect. Mrs. Pemberton maintained her distance, observing Eliza with the sharp eye of someone waiting for failure. Miss Graves ignored her entirely, which Eliza took as a small blessing. But it was on the evening of her 7th day that everything shifted. Eliza had been sent to collect preserves from the cellar storage, a task that required passing through the main house rather than the servants' corridors. She'd been warned to move quickly and quietly, to pretend she was invisible should she encounter any member of the family. She was returning, arms full of glass jars, when she heard it. Music, piano music, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere down a side corridor she'd been instructed to avoid. She should have kept walking, should have returned directly to the kitchen, but the music pulled at something deep inside her. It had been so long since she'd heard anything beautiful, anything that spoke to something beyond mere survival. She followed the sound to a closed door. Through it, she could hear someone playing scales, the same passage repeated over and over with mechanical precision. Not beautiful after all, she realized, merely practice, dutiful and joyless. Then the playing stopped, and she heard a voice. The Duke's voice. "Sarah, is someone there?" Eliza froze. She should run, but before she could move, the door opened, and she found herself face to face with the Duke. He stood in the doorway of what appeared to be a music room, his expression startled. "Miss Marin, you're far from the kitchen." "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I was collecting stores. I heard the music and—" She trailed off, unable to explain what had drawn her. He studied her for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. "You play?" "A little, my lord. The church organist in Manchester taught me when I was young. I haven't touched an instrument in years." To her astonishment, he gestured her inside. The music room was beautiful, all warm wood paneling, and tall windows that caught the evening light. But the centerpiece was the grand piano, its surface dusty despite the house's usual meticulous care. "My late wife's instrument," the Duke said quietly. "No one has played it since her death. I was attempting to, but I lack her talent." He paused. "Would you play something? Anything you remember?" Eliza's arms were still full of preserve jars. The Duke took them from her without ceremony and set them on a side table. Then he waited, his expression unreadable. She approached the piano as one might approach something sacred. The keys were ivory, yellowed slightly with age. She sat on the bench, her work-roughened hands hovering over them. What could she play that would be appropriate? What did she even remember? Her fingers found the keys almost of their own accord. A hymn, simple and old, one her mother had sung while sewing. "Abide with me." The notes came haltingly at first, her fingers remembering slowly. Then, with more confidence, she closed her eyes and let the music carry her back to better days. To her father's workshop, with its smell of sawdust. To her mother's voice singing this very melody. To a time when she'd been whole and safe and loved. When the final notes faded, silence filled the room. Eliza opened her eyes to find the Duke standing by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. She'd made a terrible mistake. She'd overstepped, reminded him of his loss, caused him pain. I'm sorry, Your Grace, I shouldn't have. No. His voice was rough, barely controlled. Thank you, Miss Marin. That was. He stopped, seemed to gather himself. My wife played that hymn. At our wedding. He turned to face her, and Eliza saw something that shocked her to her core. His eyes were wet with tears, though none had fallen. The cold mask had cracked, and beneath it was raw, unhealed grief. You should return to your duties, he said, but there was no harshness in it. Eliza fled, leaving the preserved jars behind, her heart pounding. She'd seen beneath the Ice Duke's frozen exterior, and what she'd found there was a man drowning in sorrow, desperately trying to remember how to feel anything at all. Behind her, in the music room, Alistair stood alone, one hand on the piano's closed lid, feeling something move in his chest that he'd thought dead and buried with Catherine. 2 weeks had passed since the music room incident, and something had fundamentally changed in the household. The Duke, who had previously spent his evenings in solitary isolation, began appearing in unexpected places. The kitchen for a glass of water, the servants' hall to inquire about a matter that could easily have been handled by Mr. Gray, the corridor near the library at precisely the time Eliza was dusting. Mrs. Pemberton noticed. Her lips grew thinner with each passing day, her observations sharper, but she said nothing directly, at least not where Eliza could hear. It was on a Tuesday evening after the dinner service had been cleared and the kitchen cleaned, that the summons came. Sarah appeared, breathless and wide-eyed. Miss Marin, His Grace requests you attend him in the library. The kitchen fell silent. Mrs. Patterson looked concerned. The scullery maid's mouth dropped open. Now? Eliza's voice came out barely above a whisper. He said immediately, miss. Eliza removed her apron with trembling hands, smoothed her dress, and followed Sarah through the house. This time, she noticed details she'd missed before, the way the lamplight played across the paintings, the deep silence that filled these grand rooms, the weight of history in every corner. Mr. Graves opened the library doors with his usual disapproving expression. Inside, the Duke stood by the fireplace, a book in his hands. He looked up as she entered. Miss Marin, thank you for coming. Please, sit. She perched on the edge of a chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Everything about this situation was improper. A servant, alone with the master, in the evening, behind closed doors. The scandal would be tremendous, if anyone knew. Perhaps they already did. The Duke seemed unaware of the impropriety, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He held up the book he'd been reading. Wordsworth. You mentioned him the other evening. I've been rereading his poems, trying to see what you saw in them. Your Grace, I'm not sure I should. Tell me, he interrupted gently. What did you mean when you said his poetry speaks to those who've known loss? Eliza hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but something in his eyes, some genuine seeking, made her answer honestly. He writes about memory, my lord, about how the past lives in us, shapes us. Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather, find strength in what remains behind. She quoted from memory. I find comfort in that. The idea that loss doesn't erase what was beautiful, it just changes how we carry it. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, recognizing in him the same desperate need she'd felt in her darkest hours, the need to know that survival was possible, that the weight of grief wouldn't crush her forever. You lost your parents, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, my lord. My father first, then my mother 2 years later. And yet you speak of finding strength. How? I'm not sure I have found it, Your Grace. Most days I'm simply trying to survive until the next. But my mother told me before she died that I came from love, that whatever happened I should remember that. Her hand went to the locket at her throat. I tried to honor that, to live in a way that would make them proud, even when I'm scared and alone and everything seems impossible. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, my lord. The Duke set down his book and moved to the window, looking out at the dark gardens. My wife died 3 years ago in childbirth. Our daughter lived only hours. His voice was flat, carefully controlled. I thought if I simply continued day after day, the pain would eventually fade. But it hasn't. It's simply become familiar. I'm so sorry for your loss, Your Grace. Everyone is sorry. No one knows what to do with grief that refuses to resolve itself neatly. He turned back to face her. But you understand, don't you? You've lived it. Yes, my lord. These past weeks, since you arrived, something has shifted. I don't know how to explain it, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than numbness. Anger at your circumstances, curiosity about your thoughts, even joy, hearing you play Catherine's piano. He paused. I'm not certain this is appropriate, Miss Marin. Any of this. But I find I value our conversations. I value them as well, Your Grace. The admission felt dangerous, but it was true. Then perhaps we might continue them. Occasionally. If you're willing. I am, my lord. What neither of them said, what hung in the air between them, like morning mist, was that they'd crossed some invisible line, that whatever this was, it had moved beyond master and servant, beyond charity and gratitude, into territory neither fully understood. When Eliza returned to the servants' quarters that night, she found Mrs. Pemberton waiting in the hallway, her expression grave. A word of caution, girl. His Grace is a good man, but he's grieving and lonely. Don't mistake kindness for something more. Don't allow yourself to hope for what cannot be. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. But as Eliza lay in her narrow bed, she knew it was already too late for warnings. The library meetings became routine over the following fortnight. 3, sometimes 4 evenings a week. After her kitchen duties were complete, Eliza would be summoned. They talked of books, of philosophy, of the nature of loss and memory. The Duke began to smile occasionally, a small thing but remarkable to those who'd known him only as ice. He told her about Catherine, how they'd met at a ball in London when he was 25, and she barely 20. How she'd challenged him at every turn, refusing to be impressed by his title or wealth. How their marriage had been based on genuine affection rather than mere social advantage. How her death had felt like losing half of himself. Eliza shared her own memory, her father's patient teaching, his belief that education could lift anyone beyond their circumstances, her mother's gentle wisdom, her ability to find beauty in the smallest things, the slow dissolution of everything she'd known, until she'd found herself at Thornfield's gates with nothing but pride and desperation. One evening, the Duke asked about her education more specifically. Your father taught you literature and mathematics. Everything he could. He'd been educated himself before circumstances forced him into carpentry. He never accepted that birth should determine a person's worth or knowledge. A wise man. The Duke poured 2 glasses of sherry, something he'd begun doing in recent weeks, treating her less like a servant and more like an equal. Tell me, what did you think you might become before your father's death? Eliza accepted the glass, though the intimacy of sharing wine with the Duke still felt surreal. I used to imagine teaching, opening a small school for working girls, teaching them to read and write. My father said education was the only real path to dignity for those born without advantages. He was right. The Duke's expression grew thoughtful. I employ 20 people on this estate. Half of them cannot read. It never occurred to me to address it. Why would it, my lord? Most people of your station believe servants need only know their duties. But you don't believe that. I believe everyone deserves the chance to better themselves. My father proved it's possible. The Duke stood and moved to his desk, retrieving a leather-bound journal. I've been writing again. I haven't done so since Catherine died. Just thoughts, observation, trying to understand what's changed. He didn't need to specify what had changed. They both knew. May I ask what you've written? Your Grace, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to anticipate something, to look forward to an evening's conversation, to care about another person's thoughts and opinions. He set the journal down, his grey eyes meeting hers with unusual directness. You've awakened something I thought permanently buried, Miss Marin. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eliza's heart raced. This was dangerous territory. They'd been dancing around it for weeks, but hearing him acknowledge it so directly made everything real. Your Grace, A sharp knock interrupted her. Mr. Graves entered without waiting for permission, his face grave. Your Grace, a letter has arrived from London, from Lady Margaret. The messenger indicated it was urgent. The Duke took the letter, broke the seal, and read quickly. Eliza watched his expression shift from curiosity to concern, to something that looked like resignation. Thank you, Graves. That will be all. When the butler had departed, the Duke handed Eliza the letter. She hesitated, but he gestured for her to read it. The handwriting was elegant, the tone anything but. My dear brother, I write with considerable concern regarding rumors that have reached London through various channels. It is said that you have taken a woman of uncertain background into your household, that you spend considerable time in her company, and that the staff at Thornfield are scandalized by the impropriety of the situation. I cannot believe you would be so foolish as to risk your reputation and standing for what can only be a momentary fascination, born of your continued grief. I urge you to reconsider whatever arrangement exists and to remember your duty to our family name, your loving sister, Margaret. Eliza's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Your Grace, I should leave. I never meant to cause you trouble. I never meant... Stop. His voice was firm but not harsh. My sister means well, but she doesn't understand. Understand what? She's right. This is improper. I'm a servant in your house. The gossip alone could damage your standing in society. Do you know what I've realized these past weeks? The Duke moved closer, his voice dropping. I don't care about society's opinion. For 3 years I've done everything properly, maintained appearances, fulfilled duties, and I've been miserable every single moment. Then you arrived, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be alive. But your position, your reputation mean nothing if I'm dead inside. He reached out, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. I'm not asking you to understand this, Miss Marin. I barely understand it myself, but I will not send you away because my sister disapproves. Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes. What are we doing, Your Grace? Where can this possibly lead? I don't know, he admitted, but I know I'm tired of living in ice. That night, alone in her room, Eliza held her mother's locket and wept. She was falling in love with a man she could never have. A duke, a peer of the realm, whose world was as far from hers as the moon. And he, she feared, was falling too. The letter from Lady Margaret lay on the Duke's desk like an accusation, but beside it, open to a fresh page, was his journal, and in it, written in his careful hand, were words he'd never thought to write again. I think I might be happy. The Duke's response to his sister arrived by morning post, sealed and sent before he could reconsider. In it he'd written simply that his household arrangements were his own concern, that he appreciated her worry but did not share it, and that she need not trouble herself further on the matter. Margaret's reply came 3 days later, longer and more pointed. She reminded him of his obligations, of the family name, of what society expected from a man of his position. She suggested, with barely concealed frustration, that his judgment remained clouded by grief. She urged him to consider consulting with the family solicitor about appropriate conduct. He filed her letter away and continued his evening meetings with Eliza. But the damage had been done. The household staff, already whispering, now whispered louder. Mrs. Pemberton's disapproval became impossible to ignore. Even Patterson, previously kind, began treating Eliza with a certain distance, as though proximity to scandal might prove contagious. It was Mr. Graves who finally addressed it directly. He found Eliza in the scullery 3 weeks after Lady Margaret's first letter, polishing silver that didn't need polishing, trying to make herself useful and invisible simultaneously. "Miss Maron, a word." She followed him to his small office, off the servants' hall, her stomach tight with dread. "I've served this family for 30 years, he began without preamble. "I was here when His Grace was born. I watched him grow, marry and nearly die of grief when Lady Catherine passed. I have never seen him behave as he does now. Miss Graves, I assure you nothing improper has. I'm not concerned with impropriety in the sense you mean." He held up a hand. "I'm concerned with the inevitable outcome of this situation. His Grace is a peer of the realm. You are respectfully, no, this cannot end well for either of you, but particularly not for you. I know that. Do you? Because from where I stand, you appear to be allowing this to continue. You could request a position elsewhere. I would provide an excellent reference. Mrs. Patterson would do the same. You could leave before this becomes something neither of you can recover from." Eliza met his eyes. "Has His Grace asked me to leave?" "No." "Then I will stay. I've done nothing wrong, Mr. Graves. We talk. We discuss books and ideas. If society finds that scandalous, that speaks to society's poverty of imagination, not ours." Something flickered in the butler's stern expression. Respect, perhaps. Or merely resignation. "You're braver than I thought," he said quietly. "Or more foolish. I haven't decided which." That evening, Eliza arrived at the library to find the Duke agitated, pacing before the fire. He turned when she entered, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking about my sister's letters, about what she said." He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its usual careful arrangement. "She's not entirely wrong. This situation is irregular. It puts you in an impossible position. Are you sending me away?" Eliza forced herself to ask the question directly. "No, God, no." He moved closer. "But I've been selfish. I've been thinking only of my own need for companionship, for intellectual stimulation, for someone who understands grief. I haven't considered what this cost you. The whispers, the judgment, the damage to your reputation among the staff." "My reputation was already damaged, Your Grace. I arrived here as a vagrant. Many amiting poorly of me, but I'm making it worse. Every evening we spend in conversation is another mark against you, another reason for people to assume the worst. And what do you propose? That we stop talking? That you return to your isolation and I to my proper place in the kitchen, and we both pretend these weeks never happened?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to pain him. "I only know that I'm being unfair to you." Eliza took a breath, steadying herself. "Your Grace, may I speak plainly?" "Always. These evenings are the only time I feel truly myself. In the kitchen, I'm grateful to work, grateful to eat, grateful to have a bed. But with you, I'm allowed to think, to discuss ideas, to be more than just a pair of hands to scrub pot. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The sense that my mind matters, that I matter. You do matter. Then let me choose for myself whether this is worth the cost. Don't make decisions for me based on some notion of protection. I'm not fragile, Your Grace. I've survived things that would break most people. I can survive gossip." The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You're extraordinary, Miss Maron. Do you know that? I'm ordinary. I've simply had to become resilient." No. He stepped closer still, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes. "Resilience is common enough, but resilience combined with grace, intelligence, and genuine kindness, that's rare. That's extraordinary." The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Eliza knew she should step back, maintain proper distance, but she couldn't seem to move. "We should be careful," she whispered. "I know. People are watching. I know. This cannot end well. I know that too." His voice was rough. "But I find I can't bring myself to care." Neither moved. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere in the house, A clock chimed the hour, and two people, separated by every social barrier their world could construct, stood in the charged silence, knowing they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. The Duke began taking morning walks in the garden. This was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was that he began taking them at precisely the time Eliza collected herbs for Mrs. Patterson. The first morning it might have been coincidence. He nodded as she curtsied, then continued on his path. The second morning he paused to ask what she was gathering. By the third morning they were walking together, her basket over her arm, their conversation picking up where the previous evenings had left off. "You mentioned your father believed in education for all," he said one morning, as they walked between rows of lavender. "What would he have thought of the current system, the way wealth determines access to knowledge?" He found it unconscionable. He used to say that England's greatest waste wasn't coal or water or land, but minds, thousands of minds capable of great things, left to rot in ignorance because of the circumstances of their birth. He sounds like a radical. He was practical. He knew that an educated workforce would benefit everyone, including the wealthy. But more than that, he believed knowledge was a moral right, not a privilege. The Duke was quiet for a moment, considering, what if someone were to establish a school here on the estate for the children of tenants and staff? Would such a thing be feasible? Eliza stopped walking, turning to look at him fully. "Your Grace, are you serious?" "I'm exploring the idea. You said you once dreamed of teaching. The estate has empty buildings that could be converted. I have resources that sit idle, while children grow up unable to read their own names." He met her eyes. "Would you be willing to help establish such a school, to teach there?" Her heart swelled with something too large to name. "You would do that? Create a school for children who will never repay you, never enhance your standing, never matter to society," he finished. "Yes, I would do that. Perhaps I'm tired of caring only about things that matter to society." Something in his voice made her understand this wasn't only about the children. This was about choosing a different path, about valuing things his world considered worthless. They continued walking, planning, imagining what subjects would be taught, how many students could be accommodated, whether older children already working could attend evening classes. The conversation filled both of them with an energy that had nothing to do with the crisp morning air. It was as they rounded the corner near the rose garden that Eliza stopped abruptly. There, placed carefully on the stone bench where they often paused to rest, was a small bundle of wildflowers. Not the cultivated roses that grew in formal beds, but simple field flowers. Daisies, clover, wild chamomile. "Did you?" she started to ask, then saw his face. He was looking at the flowers with an expression of surprised delight. "Someone knows we walk here," he said quietly. "Someone is blessing it." Eliza picked up the bundle. Tied around the stems was a piece of kitchen twine, and tucked into the binding was a small note. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Mrs. Patterson's practical script, for brightening dark corners, both in kitchens and in hearts. Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes. The old cook understood. Despite the scandal, despite the impossibility, she understood and approved. "I'll put them in your study," Eliza said softly. "If that's acceptable, more than acceptable." Later that day, the wildflowers appeared in a simple glass vase on the Duke's desk. They were not elegant or refined. They would have looked absurd in the formal rooms with their expensive arrangements of hothouse flowers. But in the study, they brought something vital: color, life. The suggestion that beauty didn't require cultivation or pedigree. Miss Pemberton saw them when she passed by the study that afternoon. She said nothing, but her lips pressed together in a line so thin it nearly disappeared. Mr. Graves saw them and raised an eyebrow, but he too remained silent. The younger servant saw them and smiled, recognizing Mrs. Patterson's work, understanding the gesture for what it was. And the Duke, working at his desk that evening, found his eyes drawn to them repeatedly. Simple flowers, wildflowers, things that grew without permission or planning. Things that thrived despite neglect, that returned year after year. that refused to be cultivated into submission. Rather like Miss Marin herself, he thought. When Eliza arrived for their evening conversation, she saw the flowers prominently displayed and felt something shift in her chest. This man, this duke, who had everything refined and expensive at his disposal, had chosen to feature her humble offering in the most personal room of his house. "They're lovely," he said when he saw her looking at them. "Thank you for placing them here. They're from Mrs. Patterson, not me, but you brought them to me. That's gift enough." The evening's conversation was different somehow, more relaxed, more open. They talked about the proposed school, but also about smaller things, books they'd loved as children, foods they couldn't stand, silly fears and secret hopes. The kind of conversation that had nothing to do with philosophy or grief, and everything to do with simply knowing another person. When Eliza finally returned to her room that night, exhausted but somehow lighter than she'd felt in months, she found a small bundle on her pillow, wildflowers identical to those she'd placed in the Duke's study, and a note in his hand, "For brightening my dark corners. With gratitude, H." She pressed the flowers to her face and let herself cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she was, against all wisdom and reason, completely in love with Alistair Hawthorne. The tension had become unbearable. For 3 days, Eliza had avoided the library, claiming exhaustion, pleading tasks that required her attention. The Duke had not pressed, though she'd seen the confusion and hurt in his eyes when Mr. Graves delivered her excuses. She couldn't continue this way. Every day she stayed, every conversation they shared, every moment their eyes met across a room made the inevitable end more painful. She was a servant in his house, a woman with no name and no prospects, and he was a duke. The mathematics of impossibility were clear. She would leave. She had to leave, before her heart became so entangled she could never recover. On the 4th evening, alone in her room, she began to pack her few possessions. The borrowed dresses Mrs. Pemberton had given her, the spare apron, her mother's locket. She would ask for 1 month's wages, enough to reach another town and find work. She would leave a note thanking the Duke for his kindness. She would disappear before dawn, before anyone could stop her, before she had to see his face and explain what she barely understood herself. She was folding her nightdress when the locket slipped from her pocket and fell to the floor. It landed hard on the wooden boards, and she heard a small crack. Her heart seized. Not the locket, not her last connection to her mother. She snatched it up, examining it frantically. The brass casing had bent slightly at the corner, and something was wrong with the back. The interior seemed thicker than it should be. With trembling fingers, she pried at the backing. It resisted, then suddenly gave way. And behind the portrait of her grandmother, tucked into a space she'd never known existed, was a folded piece of paper. The paper was old, yellowed, the folds deep with age. Eliza unfolded it carefully, afraid it might crumble in her hands. What she saw made her breath stop. It was a birth certificate. Her birth certificate, but not as she'd understood it. Eliza Ann Marin, born 14th March, Edith's mother, Anne Clarissa Ashworth, father Thomas Marin, carpenter. Ashworth. Her mother's maiden name had been Ashworth, but below that, in smaller text, a note in careful legal script: Anne Clarissa Ashworth, daughter of Baron Edmund Ashworth, of Ashworth Hall, Derbyshire. The room tilted. Eliza sat down hard on the bed, the certificate shaking in her hands. Her mother had been the daughter of a baron. Her mother had been nobility, however minor. Which meant she, Eliza, was not simply the daughter of a carpenter and a seamstress. She was the illegitimate granddaughter of a peers. Her mind raced, pieces falling into place. Her mother's education, her refined manners despite their poverty. The way she'd never spoken of her family, always claimed they were dead. The locket she'd insisted Eliza keep, as though it held more than just a portrait. A knock at the door startled her. Before she could respond, it opened, revealing Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper's eyes went immediately to the open trunk, the folded clothes, the obvious signs of departure. "So you're running," Mrs. Pemberton said flatly. "I thought you had more spine than that." "Mrs. Pemberton, let me see what's upset you." The older woman's sharp eyes had found the certificate in Eliza's hands. She crossed the room and took it before Eliza could protest. She read it quickly, her expression shifting from disapproval to shock, to something that might have been understanding. "Well," she said quietly, "this complicates things. My mother never told me. All these years she let me think we were simply common people. Why would she hide this? Shame, most likely, or protection." Mrs. Pemberton sat on the bed beside her. Baron Ashworth's daughter, running off with a carpenter, bearing his child. There would have been scandal. She was likely disowned, cut off complete. She probably thought keeping it secret would keep you safe from that shame. But I have noble blood. Illegitimate but noble. Does that change anything? Mrs. Pemberton's laugh was bitter. Change what? You think society will welcome the bastard granddaughter of a minor baron? You'll be even more scandalous than before. An educated servant is curious. An illegitimate peer is an abomination. Eliza felt tears burning. Then I truly should leave. I'm making everything worse for him. His sister was right. Or, Mrs. Pemberton said slowly, you stay and face this honestly. You show His Grace this certificate. You let him decide what it means. Why would you want me to stay? You've disapproved from the beginning. I've disapproved of the impropriety, but I've watched His Grace these past weeks. He's alive again. He laughs. He makes plans for the future. He's become the man he was before grief destroyed him. She stood, smoothing her apron. I loved Lady Catherine like a daughter, but she would not want him to spend his life as a ghost. If you make him happy, if you've brought him back to himself, then perhaps the impropriety is worth it. She walked to the door, then paused. Give him the choice, Miss Marin. Don't run like a coward. You owe him that much. When she was gone, Eliza sat in the silence, holding the certificate that had rewritten her entire history. She was Eliza Marin, daughter of a carpenter, but she was also the granddaughter of Baron Ashworth, illegitimate but undeniable. The question was, would this revelation make things better or infinitely worse? Eliza didn't sleep that night. She sat by the small window in her room, watching the sky shift from black to grey to the pale gold of dawn, the birth certificate clutched in her hands. By the time the household began to stir, she'd made her decision. She found the Duke in his study at 8 o'clock, earlier than their usual meetings. He looked up from his correspondence, surprise and relief crossing his face. Miss Marin, I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. I was, Your Grace. I need to speak with you about something important. His expression shifted to concern. He set down his pen immediately. Of course. Please, sit. She remained standing, her hands trembling as she held out the certificate. I found this hidden in my mother's locket. I think you should read it. He took the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly. She watched his face as comprehension dawned. Shock first, then confusion, then something she couldn't quite identify. Your mother was Baron Ashworth's daughter. Yes, my lord. She ran away with my father. I assume she was disowned. She never spoke of it, never told me. I only discovered it last night when the locket broke. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, rereading the document. Baron Ashworth died 6 years ago. I knew him slightly. He had no legitimate heirs. The title went to a distant cousin. I want nothing from his estate, Your Grace. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I only thought you should know, before. She faltered. Before I leave. His head snapped up. Leave? Why would you leave? Because this makes everything worse. not better. I'm not just a common servant now. I'm illegitimate nobility, an embarrassment to two worlds. I don't fit anywhere, Your Grace. I never have, but now I understand why." He stood, moving around the desk to face her. "You think this changes how I see you? It should. It changes everything. Your sister was right to worry. Associating with me now is even more scandalous than before. Or," he said quietly, "it changes nothing that matters and everything that doesn't. I don't understand. Society cares about bloodlines, about legitimacy and proper lineage, but you're still the same person you were yesterday, still intelligent, kind, resilient, the woman who plays hymns that make me remember how to feel, the woman who talks about education and justice with such passion, it rekindles something I thought dead. A piece of paper doesn't change that, but it does change what people will say, what they'll think. Let them think what they will." His voice grew firm, decided. "Miss Maron, Eliza, these past weeks have taught me something crucial. I spent 3 years doing everything society expected. I mourned properly. I maintained my dignity. I fulfilled my duties. And I was dying inside. Then you arrived, and I remembered what it meant to be alive, to care about something beyond obligation. Your Grace, I've made a decision." He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew something. When he turned back, she saw he was holding a ring. Not the black onyx mourning ring he always wore, but a different one, gold, set with a small ruby, ornate with the hawthorn crest. His signet ring, the symbol of his title and authority. "This ring has been in my family for 6 generations. It's given to the woman who will become Duchess of Thornfield." He stepped closer, his grey eyes intense. "I know this is sudden. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impractical, scandalous, perhaps even mad. But I also know that I love you, Eliza Maron. I love your mind, your courage, your heart. I love the way you've made me want to live again." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face. "You can't mean this. You can't throw away everything for what? For happiness, for love, for a future that feels worth living." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, transforming his entire face. "That doesn't sound like throwing away. That sounds like finally choosing something for myself. Society will reject us. Your family will be horrified. The scandal will follow us everywhere. Then we'll weather it together. We'll build that school we talked about. We'll create something good from all this supposed scandal. We'll show them that genuine feeling matters more than proper bloodlines." "I'm frightened," she whispered. "So am I. I'm terrified." He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her work-roughened knuckles. "But I'm more frightened of returning to the half-life I was living before you. I don't want to be the Ice Duke anymore, Eliza. I want to be the man who chose love over propriety, who chose life over mere existence. Your sister will come. She'll try to stop this. Let her come. Let them all come." He went to one knee before her, still holding her hand, the ring resting in his other palm. "Eliza Ann Maron, granddaughter of barons and daughter of carpenters, will you marry me? Will you weather this scandal with me? Will you help me build a life worth living?" She should say no. She should protect him from himself, from this impulse that would cost him so much. She should be sensible, practical, selfless. But she'd been all those things her entire life. And where had it gotten her? To cold and hunger and desperation. This man was offering her warmth, love, partnership. He was offering her a future. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and kissed her. His first kiss, gentle and reverent, and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, both were laughing, both were terrified and elated in equal measure. Outside the study door, Mrs. Pemberton stood with her hand over her mouth, tears on her own cheeks. She'd come to deliver the morning post and had heard everything. Now she hurried away to inform the household, knowing that Thornfield Manor was about to become the center of the greatest scandal Yorkshire had seen in decades. And in the study, 2 people who should never have met, who came from worlds that should never have intersected, held each other and chose to face whatever came next, together. The household erupted in whispers within the hour. Miss Pemberton, despite her tears, maintained her professionalism, but the news spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire. Some were delighted, particularly Mrs. Patterson, who embraced Eliza fiercely in the kitchen. Others were scandalized, certain this would bring ruin to the entire estate. The Duke sent word to his solicitor in London, requesting immediate consultation on marriage settlements and legal protections. He wrote to the local vicar, arranging a special license. He moved through these preparations with calm determination, as though sheer will could smooth the path ahead. It was 3 days later when Lady Margaret arrived. Eliza was in the garden, attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy by gathering herbs, when she heard the commotion at the front entrance. A carriage, fine and imposing, had swept up the drive. From it emerged a woman in traveling clothes of obvious quality, her face set in lines of fury barely contained. "Where is my brother?" Lady Margaret's voice carried across the grounds. "Fetch him immediately." Eliza set down her basket and hurried toward the servants' entrance, knowing this confrontation had been inevitable. She'd barely reached the kitchen when Sarah burst in, breathless. "Miss Maron, His Grace requests you attend him in the drawing room. His sister has arrived." The drawing room was the most formal space in Thornfield, used only for important guests. Eliza had never entered it before. She walked through its ornate doors to find the Duke standing by the fireplace, his expression calm but his jaw tight. Lady Margaret stood near the window, her traveling cloak still around her shoulders, her face flushed with anger. "This is her?" Margaret turned as Eliza entered. "This is the woman you proposed to marry. Lady Margaret, may I present Miss Eliza Maron." "Eliza, my sister, Lady Margaret Ashford." Eliza curtsied, keeping her eyes lowered. "My lady, don't my lady me." Margaret's voice was sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage you've caused? My brother was one of the most respected peers in England. Now he's become a laughingstock. All because some vagrant girl caught his eye during a moment of weakness. Margaret, that's enough." The Duke's voice cut through the room like ice. "It is not enough. Someone needs to speak sense to you since you've clearly lost your mind." She turned back to Eliza. "How much? Name your price. I'll pay you to leave quietly, to disappear and never contact my brother again." The insult burned, but Eliza forced herself to remain calm. "I want nothing from you, Lady Margaret. And I'm not leaving. You insolent. I said enough." The Duke moved to stand beside Eliza, his hand finding hers. "Margaret, I understand your concern, but this is not a momentary madness or a mistake. I love Eliza. I intend to marry her. You can accept that and remain part of my life, or you can continue this hostility, and we'll have nothing further to say to one another." Margaret stared at him, genuine shock replacing her anger. "You would cut me off? Your own sister? I would choose my wife over anyone who treats her with disrespect, even family." The silence stretched. Margaret's eyes moved between them, seeing their joined hands, the matching determination in their faces. Something in her expression cracked. "You truly love her," she said quietly. "This isn't grief or loneliness, or some flight of fancy. You genuinely love this woman." "With everything I am." Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted, rather than angry. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke without looking at either of them. "When Catherine died, I thought I'd lost you too. You became this cold, distant version of yourself. I've been terrified for 3 years, watching you waste away. I thought nothing would ever reach you again." She finally looked up, her eyes glistening. "Then I arrive here, prepared for another tragedy, and instead I find you alive. Truly alive, for the first time since Catherine's death." "Eliza brought me back," the Duke said simply. Margaret studied Eliza with new eyes, seeing past the servant's dress to the woman beneath. "Tell me about yourself. Not your circumstances. You. Who are you?" Eliza took a breath. "I'm the daughter of a carpenter who believed in education. The daughter of a seamstress who taught me that grace costs nothing. I lost them both. Lost everything, and found myself at your brother's gates in desperation. He showed me kindness when he had no reason to. He gave me work, gave me dignity back, and somewhere in the process, I fell in love with him. And the scandal, the whispers, the doors that will close to you. I'm frightened of them, Eliza admitted honestly, but I'm more frightened of living without him, of returning to mere survival when I've finally found a reason to truly live. Margaret was quiet again, then stood and removed her traveling cloak. Very well, if you're determined to weather this scandal, you'll need help. Society will be brutal, but having family support might soften some of the blow. She turned to her brother. I still think you're making a terrible mistake, but I also see that you're happy. For the first time in 3 years, Alistair, you're happy, and perhaps that's worth the cost. The Duke's expression softened. Thank you, Margaret. Don't thank me yet. Wait until the dowagers of London descend on you with their opinions. But there was the ghost of a smile on her face. Now I assume there are practical matters to attend to. When is this wedding taking place? As soon as the license is ready. 3 weeks perhaps. 3 weeks. Margaret shook her head. Heaven help us all. The days leading to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Word had spread beyond Thornfield's walls. The village talked of little else. Letters arrived daily from London, some offering congratulations, most expressing shock or thinly veiled disapproval. The Duke read each one calmly, filing them away without comment. Eliza found herself caught between two worlds. She no longer worked in the kitchen, Mrs. Pemberton having quietly reassigned her duties to prepare her for her new role. But she wasn't yet the Duchess either. She existed in a strange liminal space, neither servant nor mistress, while the household adjusted to the coming transformation. Lady Margaret remained at Thornfield, her presence both help and hindrance. She drilled Eliza on social protocols, corrected her posture, adjusted her speech patterns where northern inflections crept through. She was not unkind, but she was relentless. If you're going to do this, Margaret said one afternoon as they sat in the morning room, you must do it properly. Give them no ammunition beyond the circumstances of your birth. Your manners must be impeccable, your deportment beyond reproach. I feel like I'm learning to be someone else, Eliza admitted. You're learning to navigate their world. It's different. Margaret's expression softened slightly. But don't lose yourself in the process. Whatever Alistair sees in you, it's the genuine article. Don't let them polish it away. The morning before the wedding, the Duke found Eliza in the library, staring at the shelves as though memorizing. He closed the door behind him and crossed to where she stood. Second thoughts? He asked gently. 10th thoughts. 100th thoughts. She turned to face him. Are we doing the right thing? Not for us, but for you. For your legacy, your position. Am I worth what this will cost you? He took both her hands in his. Let me tell you what you're worth. You're worth every gossiping tongue in England. You're worth every closed door, every cut direct, every scandalous whisper. You're worth it because you gave me back my life. But your reputation will weather this or it won't. Either way, I'll have you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. I have something for you. An early wedding gift. She unwrapped it to find a handkerchief. Simple white linen, but embroidered in one corner with her new initials. E.H. Eliza Hawthorne, and beneath them 2 words, courage and heart. I had it made, he said quietly, to remind you of what brought us here. Your courage to ask for shelter that night in the rain. My heart, which you somehow thawed. Whatever comes, we face it with both. Tears blurred her vision. You're making it very difficult to maintain my composure. Good. I've had 3 years of maintained composure. I prefer tears of joy to cold dignity. He pulled her close, holding her against his chest. Tomorrow you become my Duchess, not because of your bloodline or your circumstances, but because I choose you, because you choose me. That's all that matters. Promise me something, she whispered against his shoulder. Anything. Promise that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you won't regret this. That you won't look back and wish you'd chosen differently. He pulled back to look at her face, his expression serious. I promise you that every day for the rest of my life, I will wake up grateful that you appeared at my gates, that stormy night, that you were brave enough to ask for shelter, that I was somehow wise enough to say yes. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Pemberton entered, her expression softer than Eliza had ever seen it. Pardon the interruption, Your Grace. Miss Marin, your bath is ready. We should begin preparations for tomorrow. Tomorrow, the wedding, the transformation from vagrant to duchess in less than 2 months. As Eliza left the library, the Duke called after her. Eliza. She turned back. I love you. In case I haven't said it enough. You've said it exactly enough. She smiled through her tears. And I love you, cold Duke, who isn't cold at all. That night, Eliza lay in her narrow servant's bed for the last time. Tomorrow she would move to the Duchess's chambers, would sleep in Catherine's bed, would take on the role of lady of this great house. The thought terrified her, but she clutched the handkerchief with its embroidered promise, courage and heart, and reminded herself that she'd survived worse than social scandal. She'd survived starvation, loss, and despair. She could survive being loved by a good man. In his own chambers, the Duke sat at his desk, the rain-soaked handkerchief he'd given Eliza that first night spread before him. He'd kept it, had it laundered and pressed, as a reminder of the moment everything changed. Tomorrow he would place it in a frame, a tangible memory of the night a desperate woman appeared at his gates and saved his life by asking him to save hers. Tomorrow they would face society together, but tonight they each prepared in solitude, gathering their courage for what lay ahead. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but neither noticed they'd weathered one storm already. Whatever came next, they would weather together. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as though nature itself approved of what was to come. Eliza woke to find Sarah and Mrs. Patterson in her room, both beaming, bearing a breakfast tray laden with far more food than she could possibly eat. You need your strength today, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Can't have the bride fainting during the vows. The dress had been Catherine's, altered by the village seamstress to fit Eliza's smaller frame. Lady Margaret had suggested it, surprisingly, saying that Catherine would have wanted it worn again by someone who made her brother happy. It was ivory silk, simple in design but elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves. When Eliza finally stood before the mirror, fully dressed, she barely recognized herself. You look like a duchess, Sarah whispered, awed. I look terrified, Eliza corrected, but she smiled. Mrs. Pemberton arrived to escort her downstairs, and for the first time, the housekeeper's stern expression cracked completely. You look beautiful, Miss Marin. His Grace is a fortunate man. I'm the fortunate one. You both are. Now come. The vicar is waiting, and half the county has turned up despite the scandal, or perhaps because of it. The chapel at Thornfield was small, meant for family worship, but it was full. The household staff occupied the back pews, dressed in their finest. Several tenant families had been invited, and to Eliza's surprise there were others. The village baker, who'd once given her a kind word, the doctor, who'd treated estate workers without payment, families whose children would attend the school she and the Duke planned to build. These were not London society. These were not peers and their ladies, but they were real, and they were here, and their presence filled Eliza with unexpected courage. The Duke stood at the altar in formal dress, his grey eyes finding hers the moment she appeared. His expression transformed, all the careful control falling away to reveal pure, unguarded joy. Lady Margaret walked Eliza down the aisle, a gesture that had surprised them both. If your father cannot give you away, Margaret had said, then family should do it. And like it or not, you're about to become my sister. The vicar, an elderly man who'd known the Duke since childhood, smiled warmly as they approached. He'd agreed to perform the ceremony without hesitation, saying that love blessed by God needed no society's approval. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying through the small chapel. Eliza barely heard the traditional words. She was focused on the Duke's face, on the way he was looking at her as though she were something precious and impossible. When it came time for vows, his voice was steady and clear. "I, Alistair James Hawthorne, take thee, Eliza Ann Maron, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Her own voice shook, but held. "I, Eliza Ann Maron, take thee, Alistair James Hawthorne, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The rings were simple gold bands, unadorned but beautifully crafted. The Duke had commissioned them from a local goldsmith, and each bore an inscription on the inside: courage and heart. As the Duke slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembled slightly. When she placed his ring on his hand, she saw tears in his eyes. "By the power vested in me," the vicar said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The Duke kissed her, gentle and reverent, and the chapel erupted in applause. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly. Sarah was grinning. Even Mr. Graves had the ghost of a smile on his stern face. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, Duke and Duchess, two people who should never have met, but had somehow found each other anyway. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall, tables laden with food prepared by Mrs. Patterson and her staff with obvious love. It was not the grand society affair a duke's wedding should have been. There were no titled guests making speeches, no orchestra playing, no elaborate decorations, but there was joy, real, unrestrained joy. The tenant farmers toasted the couple with genuine affection. The household staff beamed with pride. Lady Margaret gave a short speech about love conquering propriety, her tone suggesting she still wasn't entirely sure this was wise, but was willing to support it anyway. And in a corner, almost unnoticed, sat a small framed letter. The Duke had brought it down from his study that morning, wanting it present at the celebration. It was Catherine's handwriting, words she'd written in the final days of her life, knowing she might not survive the birth. "My darling Alistair," it read, "if you're reading this, then I am gone. Grieve for me, yes, but do not stop living. Do not let my death be your death as well. Promise me you will find joy again. Promise me you will love again. Promise me you will live a full life for both of us. That is the only thing that would truly honor my memory. Live, my love. Live and be happy. Your Catherine." The Duke had shown Eliza the letter the night before the wedding. "She gave me permission," he'd said quietly. "Years ago, she gave me permission to do exactly this. I just needed to find the courage to accept it." Now at their wedding breakfast, the letter stood as a blessing from the past to the present. Catherine's final gift to the man she'd loved, freedom to love again. As afternoon faded to evening, as guests departed with well wishes and the household began to clear away the celebration, the Duke took Eliza's hand and led her to the music room. The piano stood uncovered, no longer shrouded in grief. "Play something for me," he said, "as my wife." As the Duchess of Thornfield, she sat at the keys, her wedding ring catching the lamplight, and played the same hymn she'd played weeks ago. But this time there was no sorrow in it, only gratitude and hope, and the beginning of something new. The Duke stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, Thornfield Manor felt like a home rather than a tomb. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Thornfield had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The most obvious change was the school, now housed in the renovated East Wing stable building. 20 children attended daily, children of tenant farmers and household staff, learning to read and write and calculate. Eliza taught 3 mornings a week, and watching her patience with the struggling students, the Duke understood why her father had believed so deeply in education's power. But there were other changes too. The music room was used regularly now, filled with sound rather than silence. The formal gardens had been partially converted to vegetable plots, providing fresh produce for both the household and families in need. The Great Hall, once used only for formal occasions, now hosted monthly gatherings where estate families could bring concerns directly to the Duke and Duchess. Society had not forgotten the scandal. Doors remained closed in London. Invitations to grand events did not arrive. When the Duke and Eliza ventured to York for shopping, whispers followed them through the streets. Some cut them directly. Others stared with undisguised curiosity, but the Duke found he cared less than he'd expected. What did it matter if Lady Ashworth snubbed them at the theatre, when Mrs. Patterson hugged Eliza in the kitchen each morning? What did closed London doors mean when his own home had become a place of genuine warmth? Lady Margaret visited regularly, and her support in society circles, while not erasing the scandal, had softened it somewhat. She reported that opinion was divided. Some called the Duke mad. Others, particularly younger members of society, tired of rigid conventions, called him brave. "You're becoming something of an unintentional reformer," Margaret told them one evening over dinner. "People are talking about whether love should trump bloodlines. You've started a conversation, whether you intended to or not." "I intended only to marry the woman I love," the Duke replied, reaching for Eliza's hand across the table. "Well, you've done that and apparently challenged the social order in the process." Catherine would have found it amusing. The mention of Catherine no longer brought pain. The Duke had finally allowed himself to remember her with joy rather than anguish. Her portrait hung in the morning room, and he sometimes spoke to Eliza about her, sharing memories without guilt. "She would have liked you," he said one afternoon as they walked the gardens together. "She had your same passion for justice, your same impatience with arbitrary rules. I wish I could have known her. In a way, you do. Everything good in me that she cultivated, you've reawakened. She built the foundation. You've helped me build upon it again." The portrait commission had been completed the week before, delivered by a painter from York. It showed the Duke and Eliza in the garden, informal and relaxed, she with a book in her lap, he standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. It was nothing like the formal ancestral portraits lining the Great Hall. It was real, capturing not their positions but their partnership. The painter had protested initially, "Your Grace, a proper ducal portrait should be more formal. Inside the house, certainly, with appropriate regalia. Paint what you see," the Duke had instructed. "Paint us as we are, not as convention dictates we should be." The result had scandalized Mrs. Pemberton, who thought it entirely too casual for public display. But the Duke hung it in the entrance hall, where every visitor would see it immediately. A declaration, "This is who we are." On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Eliza woke to find the Duke already dressed, standing by the window of their chambers. "You're up early," she said, joining him. "What are you thinking about?" "About that night you arrived. How close I came to turning you away. If Graves had closed that door, if I'd stayed inside instead of walking the grounds, if I'd listened to propriety instead of instinct." He turned to her, his expression serious. "My entire life would have continued in grey numbness. I would have existed but not lived. But you didn't turn me away. No. I made the best decision of my life, though I didn't know it then." He pulled her close. "You asked me once to promise I wouldn't regret this. I want you to know, 6 months in I have not had a single moment of regret. Not when society matrons snub us. Not when old friends cross the street to avoid conversation. Not once. Not even a little. Not even a little." He kissed her forehead. "I'm happier now, handle and all, than I was in all my years of respectability. That portrait in the entrance hall, that's my answer to anyone who questions my choice. That's us, real and imperfect, and genuinely happy. Later that day, the Duke commissioned another work from the same painter, a portrait of just Eliza, to hang in the library where they'd spent so many evenings in conversation. When Mrs. Pemberton questioned the expense, he'd simply said, "She's the Duchess of Thornfield. Future generations should know her fate." The school children were dismissed for the day, running home with slates under their arms and new words in their heads. The Duke stood in the doorway watching them scatter across the grounds, these children who would grow up literate because he and Eliza had chosen to use their resources for something meaningful. "We're building something," Eliza said, coming to stand beside him. "Something that matters more than society's approval. We're building a life worth living. That's all I've wanted since Catherine died. I just didn't know how to do it alone." The wildflowers Miss Patterson had first given them months ago had been pressed and framed, hung in their private sitting room. A reminder that beauty didn't require cultivation, that growth happened even in unexpected places, that something as simple as flowers could represent hope. As evening fell over Thornfield, the Duke and Eliza sat in the library as had become their custom, reading together in comfortable silence. The life they'd built wasn't the one society expected, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Thornfield had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The most obvious change was the school. Now housed in the renovated East Wing stable building, 20 children attended daily, children of tenant farmers and household staff, learning to read and write and calculate. Eliza taught 3 mornings a week, and watching her patience with the struggling students, the Duke understood why her father had believed so deeply in education's power. But there were other changes too. The music room was used regularly now, filled with sound rather than silence. The formal gardens had been partially converted to vegetable plots, providing fresh produce for both the household and families in need. The Great Hall, once used only for formal occasions, now hosted monthly gatherings where estate families could bring concerns directly to the Duke and Duchess. Society had not forgotten the scandal. Doors remained closed in London. Invitations to grand events did not arrive. When the Duke and Eliza ventured to York for shopping, whispers followed them through the streets. Some cut them directly, others stared with undisguised curiosity. But the Duke found he cared less than he'd expected. What did it matter if Lady Ashworth snubbed them at the theatre when Miss Patterson hugged Eliza in the kitchen each morning? What did closed London doors mean when his own home had become a place of genuine warmth? Lady Margaret visited regularly, and her support in society circles, while not erasing the scandal, had softened it somewhat. She reported that opinion was divided. Some called the Duke mad. Others, particularly younger members of society tired of rigid conventions, called him brave. "You're becoming something of an unintentional reformer," Margaret told them one evening over dinner. "People are talking about whether love should trump bloodlines. You've started a conversation, whether you intended to or not." "I intended only to marry the woman I love," the Duke replied, reaching for Eliza's hand across the table. "Well, you've done that and apparently challenged the social order in the process." Catherine would have found it amusing. The mention of Catherine no longer brought pain. The Duke had finally allowed himself to remember her with joy rather than anguish. Her portrait hung in the morning room, and he sometimes spoke to Eliza about her, sharing memories without guilt. "She would have liked you," he said one afternoon as they walked the gardens together. "She had your same passion for justice, your same impatience with arbitrary rules. I wish I could have known her. In a way, you do. Everything good in me that she cultivated, you've reawakened. She built the foundation. You've helped me build upon it again." The portrait commission had been completed the week before. Delivered by a painter from York, it showed the Duke and Eliza in the garden, informal and relaxed, she with a book in her lap. he standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. It was nothing like the formal ancestral portraits lining the great hall. It was real, capturing not their positions but their partnership. The painter had protested, initially, "Your Grace, a proper ducal portrait should be more formal. Inside the house, certainly, with appropriate regalia. Paint what you see," the Duke had instructed. "Paint us as we are, not as convention dictates we should be." The result had scandalized Miss Pemberton, who thought it entirely too casual for public display. But the Duke hung it in the entrance hall, where every visitor would see it immediately, a declaration, "This is who we are." On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Eliza woke to find the Duke already dressed, standing by the window of their chambers. "You're up early," she said, joining him. "What are you thinking about?" "About that night you arrived. How close I came to turning you away. If Graves had closed that door, if I'd stayed inside instead of walking the grounds, if I'd listened to propriety instead of instinct." He turned to her, his expression serious. "My entire life would have continued in grey numbness. I would have existed, but not lived. But you didn't turn me away." "No, I made the best decision of my life, though I didn't know it then." He pulled her close. "You asked me once to promise I wouldn't regret this. I want you to know, 6 months in, I have not had a single moment of regret. Not when society matrons snub us. Not when old friends cross the street to avoid conversation. Not once. Not even a little. Not even a little." He kissed her forehead. "I'm happier now, scandal and all, than I was in all my years of respectability. That portrait in the entrance hall, that's my answer to anyone who questions my choice. That's us, real and imperfect and genuinely happy." Later that day, the Duke commissioned another work from the same painter, a portrait of just Eliza, to hang in the library where they'd spent so many evenings in conversation. When Mrs. Pemberton questioned the expense, he'd simply said, "She's the Duchess of Thornfield. Future generations should know her face." The school children were dismissed for the day, running home with slates under their arms and new words in their heads. The Duke stood in the doorway watching them scatter across the grounds, these children who would grow up literate because he and Eliza had chosen to use their resources for something meaningful. "We're building something," Eliza said, coming to stand beside him. "Something that matters more than society's approval. We're building a life worth living. That's all I've wanted since Catherine died. I just didn't know how to do it alone." The wildflowers Miss Patterson had first given them months ago had been pressed and framed, hung in their private sitting room, a reminder that beauty didn't require cultivation, that growth happened even in unexpected places, that something as simple as flowers could represent hope. As evening fell over Thornfield, the Duke and Eliza sat in the library as had become their custom, reading together in comfortable silence. The life they'd built wasn't the one society expected, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough.